Thanks for joining us today on the Fuel Growth Podcast.
What is the right growth equation for your company? Is it pipeline,
Brand,
product,
customers,
employees?
Join us as we interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, and seasoned executives to explore what it takes to propel your business into growth. Joining us today is Terese Lam, Chief People Officer at 6sense, a revenue AI platform for sales and marketing teams. Terese has over 20 years of HR experience across both large multinational and medium-sized organizations spanning the globe. She's served in a range of leadership roles, including M&A integration and cultural transformation. As a people team leader, Terese is passionate about driving impact through empowering, developing, and challenging people to be the best versions of themselves. Wow, I want that. Welcome to the show, Terese.
Great to be here. Thank you for the invite.
We're so happy to have you join us for one of my personal favorite topics, Terese. Let's kick it off by getting to know you on a personal level before we head into our conversation around culture today. I know you enjoy both traveling and cooking. What's the craziest thing you've ever eaten or maybe most memorable while traveling?
Well, the most craziest would be when I traveled to Vietnam with my family, and we were in a countryside town. It was called Sapa. Yes, it was called Sapa. And we were at a restaurant and they brought out 2 snakes. And I was thinking, what are we eating? We're eating the snake. But no, it was the heart of the snake. So they actually plonked it in alcohol and you just...
Oh my gosh.
That was probably the craziest.
What about for you, Lizzie? What's your craziest culinary memory?
I don't have any crazy memories like that because I'm not adventurous when it comes to eating, apparently. That is... I'm cringing hearing that, though, Terese. Did you know it sounds like you didn't know what was coming. How was it for you?
I think it was my uncle who ordered it. And so they brought out these little shots with white wine and the heart. And it was like, okay, let's try it.
What a visual impact there, or just everything. Sensory impact, the whole thing.
Never heard of that before.
Yeah, I think mine is eating scorpion on a stick in Beijing or ant eggs in Mexico City. Those are a couple of my crazy eating memories. That's part of the fun of traveling, though, is trying something just completely different, right?
Absolutely.
Well, tell us a little bit more about yourself, Terese. I'd like to learn more on the professional level. Tell us about your current role at the company 6sense. I love that name, 6sense, by the way. And tell us maybe a little bit about the journey that brought you to where you are today.
Yeah, sure. So Chief People Officer at 6sense, leading the people team. So my team's comprised of people partners, total reward, people operations, employee experience, talent acquisition, org development. So typical of a people team. And we're really focused on helping the company to scale. So I joined the company when it was 1,300 people. And I was the first Chief People Officer as well at 1,300 people. So you can imagine a lot of building, a lot of program development, helping the company to scale efficiently and effectively. And really, I love the building part. And, as you mentioned before in my bio, I love everything that has got to do with unlocking people's potential, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so building programs that really help seeing people develop and having great career experiences at 6sense or any company that I've been is just amazing. And I love to work on that.
We're going to dig into that growth topic more and how you scale and how you build an organization that can scale and does scale. Just before we jump into that, I'll note that you're very specific in your language to not say HR or human resources. You talk about people. And I've got to believe that there's maybe a little bit of a philosophy behind that. Can you share your thoughts on how you approach the people topic as opposed to the human resource topic?
Yeah. Actually, when I hear HR these days, and at 6sense, we still have people refer to the HR team, I cringe. And I think, why do I cringe? And it's because, this is actually a few years ago when I was at AppDynamics. And even before that, I didn't really like the word human resources, right? Because
it's a phrase that has the word human in it, but it dehumanizes the human part.
Exactly. With the resources. Yeah. So I love people, right? Because it's about people, diversity of people.
Mm-hmm.
So I cringe. I do cringe when I hear HR. But the evolution, when I first started my career 20 something years ago, don't want to age myself, but 20 something years ago, it was personnel, right? And it evolved to HR. And now, I think many more around the world, it's evolving to people and it should.
Well, I wanted to ask you, Terese, I think most of our listeners, maybe not most of them, but many of them are probably implementing growth approaches with sales and marketing at top of mind. And here we have you coming in with the philosophy around investing into the people and the actual culture of a company. So we're really excited to understand from you how you've seen companies achieve growth by investing into the people. For people that might be listening and that haven't yet thought about how the culture of their company impacts their business's ability to grow, how would you describe the benefits of culture investment, if you will?
Yeah. So, you mentioned culture of growth, right? And certainly I think people need to understand why it's important first, right? And what are the benefits of it? We all know now that the world is very different than what it was even 2 or 3 years ago, right? Pre-COVID and post-COVID. And it's ever changing. So, there's a saying, what was it? 2 things in life are certain: death and taxes. I'll add a third thing, which is change, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the speed of change is even greater now than even 10 years ago, right? Fueled by, technology and our need for digital transformation. So if you're not innovating, you're not disrupting, you will be disrupted. Think about companies like Blockbuster. I mean, it's just a classic example. It was disrupted by Netflix. And even Netflix, even today, having to constantly rethink about their business model, about their product, and how to, increase revenue, right? It's about, how to keep, shareholders happy as well, right? From a revenue perspective. So, having that growth culture is just so imperative to survive. But what does really growth culture mean, right? And it can mean different things in different companies, different experiences as well. But from my experience, the growth culture needs to permeate the people, the business, and the customer. So, what I'm talking about, the customer is the internal customers, of course, but more importantly, the customers in the broader community, right? Because we're all connected. And, making sure that you don't have a growth culture is all like growing at all cost, right? From a business perspective, but balancing that with the people.
I've heard the joke say, growth at all costs. Isn't that called cancer, right? And of course,
Right.
we want to thoughtfully grow our business. We want to grow it into a specific point, a specific direction. And your people need to feel part of that mission, need to feel empowered in that mission. And I think that's a big part of what you're talking about, right?
Absolutely. So, there's a components of that growth culture, right? So, yeah, people would need to be the center point of that, definitely.
Let's kind of tease that apart a little bit more. So you talk about the people being at the center of that growth culture and everything around it. Do you have a framework or pillars, if you will, that you've seen companies put in place or that you've put in place to help organizations with these growth objectives? How do you approach that topic programmatically within your company?
Sure. So reflecting on this, and this is by no means a playbook or set in stone, right? This is just based on my observation and my experiences. I certainly think of it in 4 components. The first one is a culture code. What I mean by that is, what's the purpose, right? And the values that connect to that as well. So I'm sure Simon Sinek, right? Start with the why. So I love the notion of starting with the why, starting with why do you exist? What's the big vision? It frames everything. And then, the values that really help you attain that purpose, right? And is aligned to what you think is growth, what growth means in your company. Then from that, looking at the people, making sure that, you have diverse people who can share different thoughts and opinions and experiences as well. And making sure that managers and leaders are exemplifying that sort of growth and having also a growth mindset. I mean, I really believe in growth mindset. Built boot camps to help people, understand their fixed mindset and how, to develop more of a growth mindset. So I love that. Systems and tools and processes, I think, will be the third component. And when I think about that is, are you looking at your systems and tools that will help drive efficiency, not slow you down? So there's a fine balance, especially with processes, between agility and structure, right? To ensure that sort of consistency and standardization, right? So we just need to make sure we're not going to be subservient to process because it can slow you down, right? When you have too much process and you make decisions on, process. I've been in big companies where that is the case. Another thing around systems and processes is making sure that, we're really recognizing and rewarding that sort of, growth, experimentation type approaches. Performance, right? Everything from, the performance cycle to how you onboard people. I mean, all of those are part of the systems and processes as well. And then the fourth component, I would say, is the environment, right? Making sure that it's agile, making sure that, there's that change agility, fast moving efficiency there as well. So versus slow and methodical, very process oriented. and really an environment that allows people to experiment and have the safety net to experiment.
It's a beautiful word to use, a safety net.
Exactly.
Terese, can we go to the first, I'll say, pillar of the code that you're mentioning and I think the value statements? Are there any, I have a couple questions on this actually. Are there any value statements that you've seen work extraordinarily well across the people of companies you've been a part of, or maybe even value statements you've instituted yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I came across the growth mindset 5 years ago and introduced it at Dynamics, for example, and certainly at Wind River, where it's a software company, been around for 40 years and was stagnant. When I started with the company, it was stagnant. Actually, revenue was going backwards. And so, what attracted me to Wind River was really the challenge and the transformation. We wanted to build a double-digit growth company, right? At least so I had to look at, how do we do that from a culture perspective? I started with the mindset, right? And making sure people weren't complacent, but always consistently challenging themselves and exhibiting behaviors that, was around curiosity, learning from each other, learning from mistakes, experimenting.
Yeah.
So I really believe in that value. And so it's kept me going, right? And even at Sixth Sense, we're starting to talk about growth mindset and mindset around that too. We talk about coachability, right? So coachability is certainly part of the growth mindset. Transparency. Transparency will be another one of my favorites. Unless you are willing to be transparent, there's always going to be a trust issue. Right? Challenge. When you're transparent, we're all adults here. We're working with adults here. And so, there's always going to be a level of transparency. You can't say everything, but, certainly I think if things are tough, let's talk about it. Let's work through those challenges, right? Rather than trying to put a facade or trying to put a different paint on the same wall. So I do think that, transparency is important and one of my favorite values as well. And I try to be transparent with my team and others as well. And I think people really do value that, right? The transparency and the authenticity behind that.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the first one you mentioned around being curious or leading with curiosity. I know this is something that a lot of companies would hope that ideally everyone in their organization would lead with curiosity and practice curiosity in their day-to-day. Maybe this goes to the third pillar you mentioned around systems and processes, but what have you seen businesses do to really enforce that message? Because it's one thing to have the value statement that you've maybe plastered on your website or materials that employees have access to. And then it's another to embed that really into the culture. Can you give an example, maybe not so much on the curiosity side, but any value statements that you have of what you've done or what your teams have done to really give employees that reminder of following that statement of what the company's values are?
So let me use the example of the curiosity or the growth mindset. And then, I'll cover how to live and breathe by those values, right? I think that's important. I think that's asking as well. So I'll share a story at Wind River. Initially when we came up with, and I went and did a whole road show with employees and all of that around, values and what those values should be. And, we did an unveiling at the company with growth mindset and everything. We did some training, on growth mindset and all the other values, what it means to live and breathe by them. But we weren't seeing the behavioral changes, right? Especially around growth mindset. You think about it, it's your mindset, right? It's not something that you can flip a switch, right?
Right. It takes time.
It does take time. And that's when the penny dropped and I thought, okay, this has to be a journey, right? The growth mindset, developing the growth mindset. And we all have, snips of fixed and growth mindset, but it has to be a journey. You're developing that over time, right? And you've got something that really supports that growth for people. So that's how we came up with a boot camp, 12 weeks boot camp. And every single week there was a different theme, and curiosity was one of them. Confidence was another, right? So that was really about, firstly, maybe I'm going in too deep here, but I love the
this
subject.
is great. This is exactly where we want to go.
So, first was getting everyone sort of centered on what growth mindset meant. Because when you say growth mindset, people think of different things, right? So, okay, centered on what does growth mindset mean? And then developing the components of growth mindset, right? So firstly, making sure you're eating, you're sleeping, you're doing, exercise well,
self-care.
Right? So
Yeah.
it's self-care. Exactly.
If you're not feeling good, you can't pour it all in, right?
Exactly. If you're not sleeping well, like all of those things, your health and well-being is so critical, right? It's become much more apparent during COVID and after COVID, right? So we had it at the very first few weeks of the curriculum. Then after that was like building your confidence, right? So because if you're not confident in yourself, you're always second guessing, your mindset's always going to be limited. How do you build that confidence, right? How do you develop that? And then from there is about curiosity. And then we went into, acting and then impacting with a growth mindset around feedback, going out there, asking for feedback, right? Not just giving that, but really asking for feedback and being in that right frame of mind when you're receiving feedback. So you're not sort of putting up a defensive mode, but really listening and seeing feedback as a gift.
Yeah.
So as you kind of walk through each of those, and boy, I wish I was in that program with you. That sounds
Same.
really neat. One of the things I think about in the growth mindset is embracing change and being open to change and being ready to accept change. And I didn't really hear you talk to that too much in there. Can you highlight the embrace change idea? And would you put that as one of the pillars of a growth mindset?
Oh, yes. Sorry, I didn't go through like the whole 12-week theme, but definitely.
There's 12 of them. You only hit 4. Okay.
We could be here all day, but embracing change is definitely one that is further around, acting with a growth mindset. So we had phases, right, in developing a growth mindset, acting with a growth mindset, and then impacting a growth mindset. So that was part of the developing and acting. So then embracing change is about, accepting that change is inevitable, right? Accepting change is there to help you grow, right? Because there are people who were change averse. I mean, I had people on my team who did, and I didn't talk about this, but, who did an assessment. You naturally do a self-assessment and it shows you where you are, either fixed or growth mindset on 8 different dimensions. There are people who are change averse, right?
Yeah.
There are people.
Well, it's a personality type, right? If you go back to the Myers-Briggs or something like that, I come out as the personality type of entrepreneur, which, I thrive on change. I actually seek change. In fact, people around me say I change things too much, too often. And
I get that.
You can't have a company of all entrepreneurs. You need people who actually focus and deliver. And a lot of those people who are more focused and delivery oriented, they don't like change. They're scared of change.
Right.
How do you coach those people to embrace change?
Yeah. And it is a mindset, right? It is a mindset because for them, it's about uncertainty, right? It's about the unknown, it's the fear of the unknown. And it's about, okay, look, learning that there's just things you can't control, right? And you just go with the flow and learn from that experience because, change is scary for everyone. And it's good that you say about the personality types. I use DISC.
Yeah, but you got to pay to get to that one where 16personalities.com is for free, right?
You do. But how do you help people who are change averse, get more comfortable with change and be more comfortable with the rate of change as well? I think that's it's a mindset shift around things that you can't control, being not fearful of the unknown, right? The uncertainty of it as well. And the other part of it is some people don't want to challenge themselves because their fear of failure too. That's the part of, the growth mindset, experimenting.
Well, that's one of the challenges that I've seen in companies growing is leaders actually beating people up for trying something new and it failing, right? Oh, you didn't think that through. And how could you let this happen? And why would you move forward without having every single thing figured out? And then that creates this kind of negative feedback loop where people are afraid of experimenting. And so on one hand, coaching people to accept change is incredibly important. But on the other hand, coaching leaders on how to accept failure or missteps in the change process. I'm not sure if I'm saying it the right way, but thoughts on that would be great.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent call out, Clinton. One I wanted to talk with you about too, Terese, understanding the coaching side of the leaders and how in your role on the people team, how do you uncover coaching opportunities for leaders that you may not have been aware of if you had not heard of it or if you're not getting the right feedback?
Yeah. So let me answer the question about the experimentation. And,
yes.
I mentioned earlier, one of the components I see is the environment, right? And so it is very important that part of the growth culture, the environment allows for people to experiment, allows that safety net, right, to experiment and make mistakes. But that's not a reason for people to make the same mistake over and over again. That's a different thing, right? And experimenting is not another excuse for bad execution. So be clear about that. It's just about iterations. Like you don't have to have it completely perfect, Because back in those days when I worked for big companies, you had to get it completely perfect before you go out and roll a program out, right? But there's piloting and then there's experimentation in a much smaller version of it that then you can start to build out and iterate, and then you go out with your big launch if you wanted to in a big company. But yeah, experimenting should not be, an excuse for bad execution.
Making the same mistake twice is a different topic than trying something new, making a mistake, learning from it, iterating, changing. Yeah, two very different formats.
Exactly. And I find that, in smaller sized companies, they have that culture already because you've got to iterate. You've got to be fast. You've got to be out there in market trying and experimenting. So I find that I see much more of experimentations in, smaller companies or medium-sized companies than the much larger ones that I was at early in my career. So coaching opportunities for managers. I think that, you want managers who want to hear feedback from their teams and making sure that they are aligned to the values around experimentation, around that sort of support mechanism to help drive that culture of experimentation. And so where there's opportunities, and so that feedback I was mentioning, it's important to still that sort of feedback loop or 360s or something like that to really help. One of those questions I do recall in a lot of 360s actually around safety net. Do you provide a safe environment for people? That question I've seen used for managers to also be aware, right, of how they're being perceived by their teams, and an opportunity for them to develop much more of a behavior and support of their teams so that they are allowing their teams or empowering their teams to experiment and holding them accountable to it as well.
So help me out here just to make sure I've got these 4 areas or 4 pillars, right? So the first one was around company goals, vision, mission, having clarity on where you're going and who you're serving. The second one is the environment, a growth mindset environment. Do I have that right?
Yeah, an agile, change agile, experimentation.
Okay, an environment of agility and change that all fits back into the values of a growth mindset in the first area. The third one was systems and processes. Boy, how many times have I over-engineered a process thinking that I was enabling a company to grow, but in actuality, I was slowing down growth because I was over-engineering next step process. And then the last one was about coaching. Do I have that right?
No, people, right? So in relation to, making sure that you have people who are embracing or continuously developing a growth mindset to continuously.
So having the right people in the right roles.
Exactly.
So not just people in general, but the right people in the right roles, a well-tuned organization that embraces all those pieces. Okay. So I think I got that down.
Yeah. Managers are a key part of that as well, right?
Well, everybody, right? From the CEO down, you got to have the right people in place that are embracing all these pieces that you described there. So as we go back to that and we think about all those pieces coming together, of course, in my mind, not only is this delivering growth for the company, but it's also delivering a really positive impact on employee retention, right? However, maybe it's gone awry at times, right? Maybe you've seen some things that you'd like to warn our audience of. Don't repeat this mistake. So can you share any tips of what to avoid or what you've seen gone wrong that had an undesirable effect? The 3 lessons learned, if you will.
Yeah, 3 lessons learned. Okay, so growing at all costs. I think I mentioned that just earlier, right? I mean, it's so easy, not now because of the economy, but certainly over the last 2 years or even a decade, right? That especially in tech with all the funding available, that it's growing at all costs, right? So basically, you have a problem, you throw money at it, right? Or that's an issue, let's throw another headcount on it, right? And so I do think that taking a step back and being much more planful about how you spend and how you look at things for organization design, for systems and platforms that you're using. I mean, every expense should matter. Right. There should be an ROI in everything that you bring in. Certainly I learned a lot at, the bigger companies where spend was very thoughtful. At Wind River, every expense mattered. And, when you have tight limits, it's amazing how you see people have become really creative.
Yeah. The lean mindset, right?
Exactly. So I do think that, a lot of companies are now taking those steps, right? And looking at efficiency, even at 6 Sense, we're looking at, operational efficiency. How can we continue to be operationally efficient and looking at an ROI on every spend, right? But companies are doing that now because things are tighter. But it should be the case, even when the economy is great. Mm-hmm. So I do think that sort of operational rigor needs to be there.
Right. So have the growth mindset, but bring a lean approach don't just throw money at everything.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of employees these days would really appreciate that, as we're seeing a lot of changes happening in the workforce and some mass layoffs occurring. And
Now, you've seen some of the news. 5 months ago, it was the great resignation and everybody was jumping from job to job as fast as they can. And then you see in the news about all of the big companies doing these layoffs, and you can see that shift happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, second lesson learned. What else do you have for us?
Putting building blocks, a bit related to the first one, but putting in place building blocks as you grow the company. As I alluded to at Sixth Sense, I was first chief people officer at the company, but this is not just for the people team function, but other functions as well. We're growing so quickly, so fast. 18 months ago, 400 people, and 18 months later, 1,300, 1,400.
Well, say that again. Your company went through what? That is incredible growth. Say that again.
I know. 18 months ago, about 400 people, and now 1,400
Wow.
people. So
remarkable.
I'm just thinking about your job day to day. It got a lot more complex. Didn't it?
Yeah. So it gets to a point where now, everything is exasperated. But if those building blocks were put in place as the company was scaling, things wouldn't be so much of a big challenge now, right? Because you're having to reel it back and start from scratch. But it would have been easier to start from scratch when, 200 or 300 people, not at 1,400.
When you're saying building blocks, can you give some examples of what that would look like?
For example, different policies that we had or compensation policies that we had worked well when the company was 200 or 300, right, or 400, but not at 1,300, right? And so when we're bringing in people who've seen scale, because that's what we're doing now, is bringing people who've seen scale. When you don't have the right compensation levels and philosophy around things, there's a compression issue, right? And so you're having to make, let's say, exceptions. And then one exception becomes another exception. And then before long, you've got a huge mess that you've got to clean up.
That's a really great point.
Especially hard when you're acquiring, right? When you do acquisitions and different levels, a title may not mean the same from one company to another. And so you're looking at two people with the same title, one coming in from an acquisition, one who's been there for a while, but they have very different pay scales. And then suddenly you've got a problem.
Yeah, we have all of that. The great news is that I've got a great team and a very supportive executive team, and we're working through it. And so we have a path. Yeah. So we're putting all those things in place now. Workforce planning, for example, before, we'll be hiring when we need it. Now, it's a much more thoughtful process around the talent that we need and why we need them, and the organization design behind that as well. Sometimes you got to step back to take 2 steps forward, right? So I do think that's important. And just the people, right? What smaller companies tend to do is you bring in people that you can afford, one, and secondly, that makes sense for the company at the size, right? And then they grow with the company, which makes complete sense, right? Like people grow, they have the institutional knowledge. And then when you get to a point where you need to see scale, bringing in a mix of people who has seen scale before, because you do want people still in the company who have that institutional knowledge, and then complementing that, supplementing that with people who've seen scale. So you need both. I do think that the people mix and starting that early rather than later is really important. I think you mentioned this, Clint, before, is, making sure you've got the right people in the right critical roles.
So would that be your third lesson learned about the people then, or?
So in every company that I've been, it's looking at doing a talent review, talent planning, looking at the org, looking at, do we have the right people in the right roles?
Right.
That will really help us scale. Who's limiting us from scaling as well? So yeah, that's really important.
Yeah, that's always a tough one, because from one perspective, it can be seen as, very corporate or even ruthless as you make those decisions. But I think, every time I've seen it play out, the company actually ends up being stronger and people are happier when the right people are in the right roles. If you've got a manager or a director who maybe got promoted too quickly and isn't quite ready, but you find a different role that fits better for them, you got to make those tough decisions, right? Even if it sometimes means you got to let somebody go and encourage them to take their career to a different place. It's a tough one, but you got to do it.
Yeah, it's tough when you talk about people first culture. People first gravitate to that, everything is people, right? You got to make sure everyone's happy. And no, it's not.
The Santa Claus mindset, right? Yeah.
It's not about that. It's about, when you need to make the tough calls, are you taking care of your people in those times as well? right? Like when you're doing restructuring, you're doing in a dignified, humane way that, is respectful to them and also celebrate what they've achieved, right, with the company as well and supporting them and caring for them post leaving as well. So just an example. But I do think that, people first sometimes get the notion of people first is that everything has to be positive for the people. But yeah, we have to make those tough calls. But how do you do it in a way that is dignified and respectful?
Right.
And transparent.
And in there, one last question, if you will. I'm coming back to your comment from a few minutes ago of scaling a company from 300 to 1,300 people over 20 months or whatever that 18-month time period. What's your number one thing that you're thinking about right now? What's the big topic right in front of you as you help the company go through that growth phase?
What's that big one? So for me, what's big top of mind for me at the moment is making sure that we have programs that in place that really show our people that we are invested in them, that we're invested in them from career development perspective, right through to how we look at performance and performance review. So I've changed the philosophy from going from a 5-point rating scale to really about the conversation and how we elevate people's performance, but it's about elevating.
Would I summarize that as retention? It sounds like to me you're talking about how do you keep the people, you've grown quickly, how do you keep the people fully engaged and delivering it all and delivering top performance? Is that the right?
Yes, the end result is about, how do we keep people engaged and connected? Many software companies are remote first, right? So how do you keep people connected? So everything from different programs to help them feel like we're invested in them through to, different social events as well. People want to socialize. People want to be connected with their colleagues. Wellness and how do we think about wellness and strategy? So,
well, certainly the difference between the winners and losers in today's economy are those who can achieve the growth mindset in a remote environment over Zoom. That's the big challenge for all of us companies that are certainly in the software space, but knowledge-based companies in general. Yeah. Absolutely.
What you're describing is the evolution of your world in managing people, Teresa. All of the multifaceted parts that you're describing. But it's not new to you that there's always going to be change, and you've managed to work around the change, especially over the last couple of years, and making sure that you have the safety for your employees, that you are considering the rewards for them, and that you're looking at their career paths within their organization. And I know we don't have much time left with you, but I did want to make sure that we had an opportunity to ask you, where can our listeners find you? Where can they learn more about you?
Find me on LinkedIn. That's the easiest.
Good.
Perfect. We may not need to ask this question anymore.
Yeah, we just say, and you can find Terese on LinkedIn.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you so much.
This is a fantastic interview, Teresa. This is actually one of our longer ones because we just really enjoyed the conversation, and your insights and your guidance are very practical, very actionable, very insightful. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us and the Fuel Growth audience. And with that, we'll wish you best of luck as you continue to grow your company and everything else that you have in front of you. Thank you again for your time today.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed it. So thank you for inviting me.